Hey everyone, Daniel here again. Today I'm sitting down with two of my favorite philosophers working today, Landon Frim and Harrison Fluss. Hello, my friends. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for having us.
All right, so we're here today to chat about a new book called Prometheus and Gaia. I just finished it. I really am excited to spotlight this book. Obviously, it goes without saying that everyone needs to go buy the book. In the conversation we're about to have, you'll learn why you need to go read this. Of all of the global crises that we're facing, from nuclear war, revamped imperialism, massive wealth inequality, the list goes on, racial apart, you name it, the ecological crisis stands out. This is a book about how intellectuals and philosophers in particular are thinking ecology. And I want to start by asking you, gentlemen, to elaborate on these two mythical views, the Promethean and the Gaian orientation or perspectives. How did you arrive at these two mythical ways of sort of condensing how the contemporary field of philosophy is thinking ecology? Where did this come from for you all?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, as against a lot of what happens in professional academic philosophy, I think real philosophy, genuine philosophy, is about what's happening in the world, what you're seeing in the news. And you're right. The thing that's the most existentially terrifying front page news is the ecological crisis, quickly followed by various economic crises, people being thrown out of work through automation, outsourcing, all the rest. And to answer your question, the reason why we came up with these two personas, the Promethean and the Gaian, is because however nuanced and diverse the range of opinions out there are, there seems to be basically these two kinds of camps. Right? The Gaian, what we call the Gaian camp, essentially says that humanity is the problem. All right, specifically human arrogance and hubris, our tendency to overshoot what the Earth can withstand. Okay, and that you can't fight fire with fire, right? And so something like the mantra, like small is beautiful, right, is the solution. You need to throw the emergency brakes on. And there's this countervailing tendency, what we label as the Promethean. And again, there's a lot of diversity within each of these camps. The Promethean basically says this humility is a mock humility. We're shooting ourselves in the foot by trying to shrink our way out of the problem. We need to grow our way out of the problem and buck up, right? And that we can find technical engineering-based solutions to the problems that many of them admit we caused in the first place. But not only are we the cause of our problems, but we may very well be the solution as well. So there's a lot of faith put in technology as sort of having its own kind of agency, even over and above human intelligence and human need.
And these are two well-known myths in the Western canon. Harrison, maybe you could help us unpacking. I want to actually start by asking you, if I could, what is a political myth? I mean, obviously on the left, we have a bit of trepidation about the mystical, and I think we'll talk about this in this conversation. A myth is somewhat of a loaded concept for the left, especially for the left, its commitments to secular atheism and humanism. You talk about myth, you're entering into the fascists can talk about myth. We know they can do that quite well. So you've identified two tendencies, but they have a prehistory in myths. So can you talk about that prehistory, but also kind of help us saying what is a political myth in your view?
Yeah. So what we try to do is talk about myth as something neutral. It's illustrative. It's illustrative of certain ideas. So just like other images and works of art, the images can illustrate different ideas. So depending on what the ideas are being illustrated, they could be reactionary ideas, they could be fascist ideas, or they could be left-wing ideas. So take, for instance, the archetype of Prometheus. There are left, centrist, and right-wing ways of deploying the myth of Prometheus. When you see how Prometheus is used by Ayn Rand, for instance, it's a very reactionary take that Prometheus wants to liberate himself from humanity. And Ayn Rand's version of Prometheus is John Galt in Atlas Shrugged. But you could also have a left-wing interpretation of Prometheus out of, let's say, Percy Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, where Prometheus represents a humanitarian kind of reason, an ally for proletarian struggle. Hal Draper, the Marxist, American Marxist in the 20th century, said Marxism is basically Prometheus plus Spartacus. But sometimes Prometheus isn't always on the side of Spartacus. So what Landon and I are trying to do is to make a sharp distinction between the mythic, which is neutral as a kind of artistic, aesthetic technology, versus the mystical, which makes what is aesthetic, makes these images constitutive of reality. So our take when it comes to art and aesthetics comes from people like Plato and Bertolt Brecht. We want to have our philosophy first, and then we can use mythology, art, and that whole panoply to illustrate these good ideas. Our other inspiration is from the oldest program of German idealism, from Hölderlin, Schelling, and Hegel from 1800, who wanted to make a mythology of reason. So you need to have the philosophy first before you start using mythic tropes, etc. And that's the good thing about Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley had a political program in mind. He had a philosophical idea in mind, and then he took these images of Prometheus and Gaia and the Demigorgon to shape that. So myth can be dangerous if it's loaded with bad ideas, but it could also be very useful in illustrating certain philosophical and political points.
So then the Promethean myth, would you say, is worth reclaiming, even though its primary avatars or its primary champions today? And I want to start by asking you to elaborate the Promethean perspective first, because within Prometheanism today, one of the most common orientations is what we call accelerationism. And accelerationism is a diverse spectrum. It has right-wing accelerationism and left-wing accelerationism. So my question is, yes, we can talk about how we might reappropriate the Promethean myth, perhaps. But let's start by what the Promethean myth is today and what its shortcomings are, in your opinion, and give us the kind of composite overview. You can mention some of the main philosophers that are associated with Prometheanism as well, if you'd like.
So Prometheus really starts with Hesiod in this Western tradition. And Prometheus, in Hesiod at least, is cast as a kind of trickster deity. He is always very cunning. He's trying to outwit the other gods. And he has this competition with Zeus. And it's a very aristocratic kind of competition. And Prometheus's relationship to humanity, when he gifts humanity fire, is more to compete with Zeus, more than to have this humanitarian concern that he loves humanity for its own sake. He's doing it instrumentally to get to that higher level, or to just be the best for its own sake. And today's Prometheanism, again, there's left-wing versions, centrist versions, right-wing versions. But in terms of the 20th century and the 21st century, Prometheanism is this take that's very technophilic, futurist-oriented. It's focused on trying to break through any limit, whether it's human or even standard notions of reason, in order to be innovative, novel, and that could be very misanthropic in certain iterations. So we're thinking about certain iterations of, let's say, right-wing accelerationism with Nick Land, or Ayn Rand's Prometheanism, the kind of elitist, aristocratic Prometheanism that you find even in Friedrich Nietzsche. And our problem is that accelerationism, the current variety of Prometheanism that's so prevalent today, comes with certain philosophical concepts that is unique to this variety of Prometheanism and not maybe so much Marx's variety of Prometheanism or Shelley's variety of Prometheanism. And those ideas of accelerationism basically exceed the human in order to get to some kind of what we would call antinomian space, what the speculative realists call the great outdoors, if you will. And science, instead of just mirroring nature in this more classical rationalist sense, that it's able to reflect nature, reveals something much more alien, much more terrifying, much more monstrous, and that we should embrace this. We should really overcome our own humanity, our own precious egoism, and embrace this great new future, no matter how terrifying it might be.
What is accelerationism? For those that may not know the term, it's maybe one of those terms that's thrown around too easily without proper, because there's obviously the general view that Deleuze and Guattari put forward, and that has been taken up, which is basically that we kind of no longer need the standard Hegelian or Marxist dialectical understanding of how to overcome the contradictions of capitalism, but that we can kind of ride these waves of accelerating capitalist forms of, I don't know, how would you describe it? Like there's this kind of weird Deleuze and Guattari prehistory to the concept, which itself also has a right-wing version in Nick Land and then a left-wing version in, say, I think are like Ray Brassier. So are Deleuze and Guattari the kind of godfathers of accelerationism, or how do you track its history, and what is it exactly?
Well, what's interesting about the Deleuzians is that Deleuze has inspired both accelerationist and Gaian camps. So my friend, Ben Hillen, actually said in this quote right after he finished reading it, you can make Deleuze into an accelerationist because everything can and must be subsumed under a logic of creation. We must always be forming new connections, new machines, new flows. But also in Deleuze, there might be a Gaian element. So you can make him fuse fact and value. There seems to be a seemingly ecological emphasis on Deleuze, a naturalizing of human praxis, an emphasis on finitude, an emphasis on Leibniz's idea of monads. So, yeah, I think that Benjamin Noyes, in his book Malign Velocities, but even before that in Persistence of the Negative, he says that these post-May 68 philosophers, with Deleuze really emphasized the most, are the main inspirers of contemporary accelerationism. The CCRU project with Nick Land and Sadie Plant was very much inspired by Deleuze. But Deleuze himself is inspired by people like Friedrich Nietzsche. And if you read Nietzsche's Nachlass, he emphasizes the need to accelerate past modernity, using the crisis of modernity, accelerating with furthering or exacerbating decadence and other forms of nihilism in order to get to something brand new, a new kind of anti-democratic dispensation.
And if I could just add, just sort of conceptually, in accelerationist discourse, there's often this contrasting of the idea of acceleration versus mere speed, right? So speed is monotonous. Speed is, the sort of decadence of contemporary consumer mass society and capitalism, where you just get a new kind of app or widget or iPhone every few months. And in many ways, taking their cue from Deleuze and Deleuzian type philosophies, there's this idea that we need to replace mere monotonous speed with acceleration. And what makes acceleration different from speed is that it's always changing. It's not just fast, but it's always on the move. It's always in a sort of imminent transformation, right? Which indeed goes beyond a kind of Hegelian dialectic, goes towards an antinomian, lawless sort of direction. But this antinomianism, this lawlessness, which you get in accelerationist discourse, is precisely the thing that in the deepest level unites in a coincidence of opposites, the Prometheans on the one hand and the Gaians, the eco-pessimists on the other. Unlike the earlier Gaians, say from the 90s, right, the eco-pessimists from the 20th and 21st century that we speak about in this book do not like the idea of Mother Earth as this sort of sedate, holistic, universal entity. They really don't like the idea of nature, typically, and especially the idea of natural laws. That's too stable, right? They hate the idea of harmony, right? Everyone from Donna Haraway to Isabel Stengers and others, Latour at times, will talk about Gaia as ticklish, as vengeful, as easily offended, and most importantly, not completely knowable. So this antinomianism, this unintelligibility really runs on both sides, and goes to the core.
So let's talk about the Gaian perspective, because in a pop culture sense, you know, it has the air of a kind of combination of what I would say kind of, gosh, I don't know, I almost want to say self-help and neo-Orientalism in a way, in the sense that it's kind of a fetishization of what we assume ancient cultures, how they had a kind of homeostatic and oneness relationship to Mother Earth. I also get the feeling, again, I'm speaking for myself here, of a kind of very almost 60s ecology movement, a kind of boomer ideology, Earth Day, and, you know, okay, already I'm laying a minefield of problems, but can you give us a proper history? Okay, where does the Gaian myth come from? Because one thing you say in the book that I thought was quite nice is you say actually it's a radically modern myth. It's not to be understood as a myth which has a true touchstone point in some ancient anthropological experience of primitive culture. That's not how to understand it. So how do we understand it?
I can start a little bit and then throw it off to Harrison. There are two, you know, if the majority of our book talks about the contemporary eco-pessimists, the Gaians, especially in the 21st century, there are two major sources of the sort of prehistory of that philosophy. And the first one comes from especially European archaeology, especially the figure of Maria Gimbutas. And, you know, it does sound 60s, but it's really 80s and 90s in a lot of ways. So Maria Gimbutas had this thesis, and it wasn't without a kernel of truth, but maybe just a kernel. Okay, she had this thesis of old Europe, and the thesis of old Europe is that there was this continent spanning, maybe more than continent spanning, ancient integrated civilization, which was gender egalitarian, or possibly, although she doesn't like to use the word, possibly matriarchal in nature. Okay, she quibbles about the language. All of these people quibble about the language, but what she describes is essentially a matriarchal civilization, which was based on worship of the goddess. Okay, as like the primary deity, based on aspects of the earth, different geographical features, patterns of this, you know, seasons, perhaps the celestial bodies, and especially this idea that women's bodies today are something like a microcosm of nature as a whole. And so what is the story? The story then from Maria Gimbutas is that at some point there was this opposing civilization, which she calls the Kurgan Civilization, named that because the Kurgans were the burial mounds that this people was most well known for. They come from the Pontic or the Russian steppes. They're nomadic or semi-nomadic and masculinist. And they invaded. And that invasion several thousand years ago, according to her, is what started the multi-millennia long horror that is male patriarchy, violence, and domination. Right? So that's and this, especially in the 90s, indeed sparked a feminist spirituality or goddess movement. Absolutely. And it did have sort of post-60s quasi-boomer self-help aspects to it. The other source, though, is James Lovelock, is the Gaia theory and the Gaia hypothesis, the idea that a sort of biocentrist idea that the Earth as a whole is in some sense living. Again, people quibble about the language. What do you mean that it's alive? And he'll always say, well, of course, I don't mean alive like how a cat's alive. And then the next question will be like, okay, so you mean it just contains living things and there's a system? We're like, no, more than that. And it's these theories are very slippery, hard to pin down. But in some sense, there's the idea that the Earth is an integrated living system. And Lovelock supposedly discovered this by observing the peculiar kind of homeostasis that the Earth's atmosphere has, as opposed to so-called dead planets like Mars. Right? These two things came together and sparked contemporary Gaianism, though contemporary Gaianism underwent an important shift in rejecting the idea of harmony, homeostasis. Okay, they kept the sort of holism, they kept the focus on the concrete, they kept the mysticism. Okay, the idea that we can't completely know the whole thing, and that human reason cannot rise above this whole in which we're merely a part. But it became darker in a lot of ways. It became more vicious, understandable given like what's in the front page of the newspaper, right? But it became, Gaia is not this homeostasis thing, which especially female bodies are a microcosm of. It's a terrifying titanic goddess that we have to worry about offending. Harrison, if you want to.
Yeah, Bruno Latour says Gaia is Artemis. She is a warrior and she's going to take her vengeance. What's interesting, though, about the connection contemporary Gaians have to Lovelock is that while Lovelock talks about this in terms of a holistic system of homeostasis, and Latour and others use Lovelock as a kind of signifier for their scientific credibility, a lot of what they say goes against that. As Landon put it, Gaia is much more composite, much more anarchic, much more Deleuzian, if you will, nomadic, monadic. And it's interesting if Lovelock ever read Latour's Facing Gaia Gifford lectures from 2013, what he would make of it. But there is continuity insofar as Lovelock says that in his prefaces later on for the initial book that he wrote about Gaia, when he's writing it after the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the death of communism, so-called, he says this is a postmodern theory. This is a postmodern theory of the Earth because Marxist rationalism can't understand the world, tries to reduce everything. It's very similar to bourgeois positivism. And you see this continuity between, let's say, Lovelock, Mary Midgley, and Latour when they attack Marxism as just this modernist project that wants to save everyone. It has this emancipatory ideal, but that's going to hurt the Earth. So what we really need to do is humble ourselves before this mysterious tremendum that is Gaia. So even though Lovelock starts more humble, more scientific, more empirical with the Gaia hypothesis, once the Gaia hypothesis is actually challenged and criticized, and people can read more about this with, I think it's Toby Tyrell's book on Gaia. Once that hypothesis is criticized, Lovelock starts to shift more and talk about the Gaia theory, that everything is interconnected, everything is part of this web of life, which is much more philosophical than the empirical theory that he had about the Gaia hypothesis, that the conditions on Earth are due to life's existence, that the life didn't adapt to the environment actually came from an explosion of biota. And people, scientists have pushed back on that a little bit. So Lovelock upgraded the theory, which is much more, I think, and Landon, I think, agrees, much more metaphysical than the original Gaia hypothesis.
Yeah, and dubious.
And dubious.
So he didn't moderate in the face of scientific criticism. He doubled down, in other words.
The other thing I want to just quickly talk about, Lovelock is, I think, almost 100 years old. He's still alive. And he wrote this book called The Novacene. And in this book, he talks about how machines are going to protect the climate against human activity. Because if the machines get smart enough and are advanced enough, AI will have an existential interest in cooling down the earth so that it can survive. So there is this coincidence of opposites even in Lovelock. In order for us to save the planet, we have to trust in advanced artificial. We have to trust in this new technological singularity that's going to come about.
Yeah.
And what these all have in common is a denial of the human frame, a denial that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, Landon. I think that the term anti-humanism is talked about a lot within Marxist circles. We know that a thinker like Louis Althusser will insist that Marxism has a certain epistemological break between the young Marx and the late Marx, and that any Marxism after Capital must affirm a steadfast anti-humanist position. Now, what's interesting about what you're talking about here is that this landscape of contemporary philosophers are obviously not all Marxists. Actually, very few of them really are Marxists, but they all share a commitment to anti-humanism in a certain way. Very curious. Talk about, one, what is anti-humanism, if we could define it broadly, and two, how these two camps, Gaian, Promethean, became anti-humanist. It seems strange to me. Maybe it's just me. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if I could, instead of trying to start with the negative and define anti-humanism, let's talk about what humanism might mean, because that'll help sort of orient what anti-humanism really truly is, as opposed to taking people's word for it, right? There's two kinds of things humanism could mean. It could mean something stupid and speciesist, which is to say that human beings as a species, okay, just because of our peculiar accidental evolutionary descent, are uniquely important and stand above nature as what Spinoza would call a special state within a state, right? And I don't know any serious people that believe that. I'm sure they exist, but they're not my friends, okay? That's not the sort of humanism that we're on about, right? The kind of humanism that we often talk about, the sort of humanism that takes its cue from certainly aspects of Marx and Engels, but also Hegel and most especially Spinoza as well, might better be called something like personism, okay? If that term wasn't already taken. It's the idea that what we are essentially is not our DNA, or not our accidental evolutionary descent, not our species, not speciesism, okay? But what we are essentially, what matters about us is that we are finite embodied intellectual creatures. And that, as Spinoza would say, our mind, for it to be called a mind, is something which can access and can reflect the general order, the general rules of nature as a whole, okay? Engels, doing this study session on anti-Düring, Engels says this ad nauseum, and you get this again as well in Marx and Hegel and Spinoza, right? So that we can have an insight into necessity, and that is the nature of human intellect and freedom, okay? It is not to say, as people who want to strawman this position, that we're supernatural ourselves, that we can know every particular detail like Laplace's demon, but it is to say that we can sort out some of the universal features of the world. That's why we can make sense of the world. That's humanism for us, okay? And why all of these figures, both on the Promethean and Gaian side, share a kind of anti-humanism is because they reject that. So don't take their word for what they're strawmanning. Let's look at what they're actually doing. They are rejecting the fundamental proposition that reality is knowable and intelligible, and therefore that we can and should try to modify reality to improve human welfare and thriving and flourishing. That's the thing they deny. They deny it in different ways. For the Gaian, they deny it because of a kind of noumenalism, okay, that, following Latour, that nature, Gaia, is a black box that we have to be humble before. We can't deign to claim to know about it, okay? And for the Promethean, it's more often, I hate to use the jargon, but it's useful here, a nominalism. Nature is not knowable not because it's this revered black box, but because it's less than nothing. It's infinitely plastic, infinitely changeable, modifiable, right, re-engineerable. So there's nothing to know, right? So for the Gaian, you can't know. For the Promethean, there's nothing to know. It's all about the will and change and re-engineering. But what do they have in common? There's not an intelligible world out there for the human mind to reflect. And therefore, there's nothing necessarily binding all humans together either. For Spinoza and Marx and Engels and the rationalists and Hegel, right? What binds humanity together, what is the source of our solidarity, is this common identity in an intelligible nature, monism. We all can reflect the same intelligible natural laws. That's what they reject in their anti-humanism.
That's amazing. Thank you for starting not with the negative, but rather with a more affirmative, and then looking at the anti-humanism. Because in the accelerationist view, on both left and right, I was always struck, and you see this with value form Marxists as well, that capital is the subject, really.
Yeah. Not
the person, not the human. Capital is the subject. And Harrison, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about accelerationism. I'm curious how you might assess the accelerationist movement right now as we're having this conversation. In my view, a lot of things have kind of transpired. A lot of, say, political experimentations in accelerationist thought have come and gone, and maybe not been borne out by the test of political experimentation, perhaps. Is accelerationism a thriving philosophical project right now, or do you see it as kind of struggling?
I think there is a bit of self-reflection going on among accelerationists. Luca Frazier said that the accelerationist label is in a kind of semantic catastrophe, is how they put it. So a lot of them, I think, are balking at the label because of how it's used in the mainstream press now. Because the mainstream press has defined accelerationism as white supremacist extremism. And in terms of the genealogy of accelerationism, it was first coined as a phrase to diagnose the post-68 continental philosophy scene by Benjamin Noyes in Persistence of the Negative. He meant this as a criticism. He kind of diagnosed the disease that took on a life of its own, so to speak. And the first person who ran with the term positively, in a positive vein, was Mark Fisher. So Mark Fisher in 2012 writes this essay called Avatar versus Terminator. And he says, Noyes doesn't like this word, but you know what? It has all this untapped potential, and we should really just go with it. But we should go with it as leftists. We should go with it as Marxists. And we have a lot to learn from someone like Nick Land. Even though Nick Land is on the political right, the extreme right, he's a neo-fascist, he's also someone that we can learn from. He's our enemy. In fact, I think Fisher once said he's our Nietzsche. So there was in that essay this attempt to synthesize Marx and Nick Land, and that was taken up by people like Alex Williams and Nick Cernak in their Accelerate manifesto, #Accelerate manifesto. And in that manifesto, they're much more strident. They invoke Lenin and Lenin's critique of left-wing communism as an infantile disorder. They talk about Promethean mastery, and they're not shy about using the phrase accelerate. But when it comes to the next book they write called Inventing the Future, it's kind of like, I think I was joking, a reformism with an inhuman face. The references to Lenin drop out, and more of a kind of Corbynite, Sanders, reformism comes in. And I think that's where they're at right now, is kind of using certain ideas from speculative realism and the CCRU project in terms of making new political myths that will motivate people out of this stagnation But the actual political solutions tend to be very much old labor, New Deal kind of politics. So right now, they seem, some of them are still embracing what they call fully automated luxury communism, and we can talk about that. But a lot of people shy away from the label accelerationism, even though the premises are still there. And people are still coming out with books like Negrestani came out with this book, Intelligence and Spirit, in 2018, which doesn't seem to use the word accelerationist, but is very, I think, left accelerationist in terms of affirming intelligence as something that overcomes all conceptions of the a priori, all conceptions of natural law, that the a priori is kind of imposed on nature in that sense with the death of God. So it's still very left accelerationist, left Nietzschean. I think there's a new book coming out. I forget if it's from Wolfendale or Brassier, called The Revenge of Reason. So there is this still left accelerationist commitment to science and technology, but still anti-humanist in its own way. They still maintain those premises.
Yeah. What do you make of an alternative to accelerationism? I mean, you're coming from the position of, a kind of rationalist, dialectical Marxist humanism. Okay, and we can define that. I mean, Landon already did a nice job defining what humanism is, and coming from a kind of Marxist-centered position there. What do you make of decelerationist? I mean, there's also a certain a flip side of this kind of nihilistic politics that I've seen a little bit as well, and I think COVID-19 has brought some of those nihilist views out as well on the left, that maybe we can't really trust in a progress narrative of using harnessing forms of modern technology to overcome the fundamental deadlocks of capitalism. So what do you think about the flip side of accelerationism? I know it may not have as loud of a microphone as accelerationism, but what do you make of that view?
Yeah, so what really I think inspired Landon and I to write this book is the kind of internal debates that are going on within Marxism today. So there are these debates between those who call themselves eco-modernists, like Lee Phillips, versus people who advocate degrowth, like John Bellamy Foster. And I think those positions are lighter shades of more consistent philosophical positions in accelerationism versus eco-pessimism. So while Foster or even Andreas Malm or Jason Moore wouldn't necessarily call themselves eco-pessimists, there's certain ideas that they use to criticize Enlightenment rationality that do have echoes or do anticipate those Gaian criticisms. And someone like Jason Moore is very much influenced by Latour and Haraway anyway. So there's these debates within Marxism happening right now. Should we just accelerate towards the good Anthropocene, or even maybe accelerate beyond that? So any kind of ecological problem is going to have this technological fix. It's kind of like the Breakthrough Institute meets Marxism, so to speak, versus what we really need to do is have a slowed down economy, slower growth, degrowth. And the position Landon and I are taking is that we shouldn't have any faith that technology is going to magically save us. What we actually need is a new mode of production to save us. So the emphasis shouldn't be we're going to have some kind of philosophical fix or technological fix. The fix is going to come from mass movements. The fix is going to come from overcoming capitalism with a new mode of production. And even then, you're still going to have ecological problems, but it's a necessary condition for resolving these issues. And something like the Green New Deal, which is based on the national interest of the United States and is not socialist and is not internationalist, is not going to save us either. What we really need to do is go back to the basics of a socialist critique of capitalism, and the aim should be to replace it with a new mode of socialist production. And that's a condition.
And by the way, people do, Althusserians especially, but people often will talk about this break between the young humanist and the mature scientific Marx and Engels. But in the mature writings, right, what is socialism? Socialism is the abolition of exchange value, right? And the social act of taking control of the means of production for use value to meet human needs, right? So if you completely abolish any idea of human welfare, comfort, and flourishing, what in the world does producing for human need even mean? If you give everything over to technology in this, supposedly high-minded, objectivist way, what exactly are you aiming at, and how do you operate society once you get there? It makes no earthly sense.
Right. You're talking about an international mass movement, elevating class struggle that is sort of pretty straightforwardly Marxist in your politics. So that all checks out with me, and that makes a lot of sense. How we do that is the topic of another podcast. I want to return to eco-pessimism, and I want to do that because if this is a kind of ideology, and we understand ideology, and you offer a nice definition of ideology from Jan Rehmann, which I guess you could sort of summarize as ideology is a refusal to confront a problem directly, right? A kind of avoidance, which I think is a very straightforward way of describing what ideology is. Well, eco-pessimism seems to me almost kind of like I'll give you an example. Some of these ideas we're talking about are interesting to me because I have 2 young children, and my daughter already expresses a lot of Gaian views of spirituality, just spontaneously as a reflection of being in this culture and being in this world. So the ideas we're talking about have a certain currency in our culture. And I think eco-pessimism has a strong currency as well. So I'd like for you to define it, but I'd also feel like you need to sort of make a defense about why we should not be eco-pessimists, because that's an ideological struggle, right? Like that's important, political education on that. But let's start by saying, okay, what is eco-pessimism first?
So when we talk about eco-pessimism, let me start negative here. We don't mean pessimism in the sense of having like a dour attitude about things. Some of the what we call the eco-pessimists, especially a character like Donna Haraway, is extremely exuberant in her writing, right? I mean, like we have like a game where we're like, how many times does she use the word bumptious, right? It's extremely exuberant. So that's not what we mean. And we're also not using the term pessimist to refer to nature or Gaia herself, although sometimes there are sort of these darker, more violent shades of describing Gaia. When we use the term eco-pessimist, we mean a pessimism about human reason, okay? So human reason's capacity to know nature, that nature has natural laws which are intelligible to us, and therefore that we can live in, manipulate, and modify nature to increase human happiness, comfort, and flourishing. That's the definition of pessimism. Of course, we need to reject that ideological position. If you don't reject that ideological position, then you're paralyzed, right? If you think that Gaia is just something out there that we have to, humiliate, literally humble ourselves before, I don't know how you can organize a small movement, let alone a mass movement. I don't know what that would even mean. Okay. However, I think that we're not anti-Gaian, just like we're not anti-Promethean. Okay, so we're anti-eco-pessimist, but we think, coming back to this idea of myth is neutral, that there are aspects of this idea, this mythic image of Gaia, which are redeemable and which are very good and counter some of the worst hubristic, short-sighted elements of modernity. So the idea that we are a part of nature and not above nature, the idea that nature is an integrated thing and not just a Sorites, a heap. Okay, these are good elements of Gaia. Any Spinozist rationalist worth their salt, anyone who calls themselves a monist, that believes that human beings are not an imperium in imperio, a special state within a state, but a modification of nature. And this is whence comes our unity with other people, because we have a common identity in nature. Okay, should be comfortable calling themselves a Gaian in a certain way, but not in the sense that the eco-pessimist does, because the eco-pessimist denies essentially human intelligence in the fullest sense. That's what they're pessimistic about.
And what's it just sounds a little crazy. Like how did philosophy get to this state? Like, it seems quite unfortunate. I mean, and here I'm asking for the benefit of non-philosophers. I mean, maybe philosophers will readily know why this has occurred. You know, there's a certain genealogy, there's a certain history, but can you say a little bit more about how we got to this place where these two dominant strains of where contemporary philosophers are eco-pessimists in this way? How did that come about?
So, to talk in terms of Lukash's The Destruction of Reason, we can say that eco-pessimism and accelerationism are kind of indirect apologetics for our contemporary capitalist world. So in terms of Gaianism, it's a kind of apologetics for austerity politics. In terms of accelerationism, it's a kind of apologetics for accumulation's sake. So Nick Land in Fake Noumena says that capital is revolutionary. Humanity is a drag. We need to go big or go home. That's why Land liked Deleuze's Anti-Oedipus as opposed to Thousand Plateaus. He thought that Deleuze and Guattari were moderating their position a little too much. So for people like Land and the early CCRU, it's about just letting technology flourish regardless of human flourishing. And that is a kind of apotheosis of capitalist accumulation. In fact, the most maybe sophisticated or pseudo-intellectual, if you will, apotheosis of capitalism. And you find echoes of that just early on after the dawn of the age of imperialism, as Lenin put it. You find it in Nietzsche, talking about life as being exploitation inherently. And how when Nietzsche defines life or the will to power, that's very similar to the operations of how capitalism works. It's just trying to gain profit for its own sake through novel commodities, regardless of the well-being of the worker. And with Gaianism, you find echoes of Gaianism in Romanticism, reacting against, let's say, industrialization, which had many horrors to it. In fact, the first working class revolts against industry were machine wreckers. Lord Byron wrote poems dedicated to King Lud. So there is this hopelessness within accelerationism, I think, and within eco-pessimism. They reject this idea of proletarian mass struggle in favor of some kind of transcendence, whether it's the transcendence in technology or the transcendence in going back to nature. And they like to call these forms of eminence or more materialistic than regular Marxist materialism, but they're, I think, in the final analysis, forms of mysticism.
Is it fair to say, Harrison, that these are sort of different emanations or types of bourgeois philosophy, or is and I know that in contemporary Marxist thought, we don't really talk about things like bourgeois ideology anymore.
Yeah.
However, based on what you just said, I mean, I can't help but feel the 20th century Marxist in me kind of wanting to call it that. Is that a bridge too far to sort of say that when it comes to eco-pessimism?
A lot of the people we talk about in the book, especially this book was written for left accelerationists and left-wing eco-pessimists. That's our core audience. Our core audience are people on the left. We're trying to convince them that these premises are incompatible with their left-wing commitments for justice, for socialism, for human emancipation, that they should give up their futuristic antinomianism or their biocentric antinomianism. So we don't want to say that there's some kind of nefarious plot going on. These people seem to have genuine left-wing commitments, but the premises themselves are accommodating of a rationalist bourgeois order.
Mm-hmm.
So
it makes sense.
It might be Marxist in form, but it is objective bourgeois in essence.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. Now, the left has a tradition of what's called libertarianism, and there's a danger with libertarianism. I mean, like people can libertarianism is connected to this notion, which you talk about, of antinomianism, or a kind of fundamental skepticism of a law-bound social order, right? And so as leftists, especially revolutionary socialists, it's important to know how to break the law, let's say. Does your aversion to antinomianism, and I want you to talk a little bit more about that, but in general, when I was reading your book, I was wondering, does your kind of critique of antinomianism on both the Gaian and the Promethean left, does that pose a problem for how the left sees kind of its own commitment to the liberatory or the emancipatory or even the abolitionist tradition?
Mm-hmm.
I want to see if you could say something about that, please.
So in terms of libertinism, if you're talking about hedonism, certain forms of experimentation, yeah, I think our philosophical program would endorse that. If we're talking about libertinism in the sense of Marquis de Sade, then no. In terms of just violent forms of transgression for its own sake, not at all. But yeah, I think that if you have this conception of reason that's really stolid and conservative, I would want to broaden it in order to encourage that kind of experimentation, hedonism, artistic play. And Landon and I wrote this book affirming myth and affirming kinds of artistic experimentation in that way, because we think art should be valorized as art. It should be something that is part of our sensory bodily experience. It's not something that we need to repress. That's
But
why.
I also,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I also think there's something really to your question here in terms of the current discourse about breaking the law, right? Like there is this ubiquitous but puerile equivocation. It's a fallacy of equivocation that's going on, where it's like, well, if you want to be radical and transgressive, you have to break the law. Therefore, believing in a lawful universe is against being radical, right? Which is idiotic, right? I mean, it's equivocation. It's like saying that you can't break the laws of nature, but I broke the speed limit. That's a law, so I broke the law of nature. This is what I teach in Logic 101. It's ridiculous, right? They're two different things. That just has to be said plainly. Those are two different things, that nature is lawful and that we sometimes should break social laws to produce a better social order. Those are just two different words, full stop, period. And beyond that, if you want to transform the social order and break the current conventions and laws, you have to know what kind of reality you're working in and what kind of thing you're aiming for. And if reality was completely unintelligible and lawless, you couldn't do that, right? What are you trying to break and what are you trying to construct? You need to know what's around you.
Right. And there's an argument that the kind of neoliberal, hyper-finance capitalism accelerates a certain social lawlessness, and even, capitalism itself is gangster capitalism and kind of
talk about ideology.
Fundamentally criminal and so on. And
for sure. I mean, talk about ideology and neoliberal ideology. That my kids come home not only with, from like the guidance department, not only a bunch of propaganda about grit, personal responsibility and grit, but also, and now it's a little bit outdated, about being a disruptor. Right. And what's the ideology of being a disruptor? It's this neoliberal idea that we just need to change, break the mold. For why, for what reason, for what end? Well, that's the wrong question. Right.
Yeah. Well, I do want to talk to you about political myths and how the left can maybe even invent or reappropriate old myths and talk about new myths. We can talk about that in a moment. But I want to narrow in on another concept that you're both critical of, which you see present on both camps, which is the idea of volunteerism. Why is volunteerism a problem? Volunteerism referring to this notion that I guess generally human agency is kind of will bound, and that, the notion of necessity can be kind of thrown out the window, and that, so I guess it's not immediately evident why the voluntarist view of political subjectivity, let's say. It's not immediately evident why that is problematic, but you all put forward a pretty strong critique of voluntarism. Could you say a little bit more about that, please?
So we're not against the idea of will, decision, deliberation. We're certainly not against the idea of agency. We're certainly not against the idea of autonomy. But voluntarism means something real specific, at least the way that we're deploying it here. Voluntarism means that the will, the choices we make, are not tied to the intellect, not tied to reason and reasons. Okay. And if the will isn't tied to the intellect, to the mind, and it's therefore free in that sense, that means it does not have an intelligible end. It does not have an intelligible goal. It's a celebration of choice for its own sake. It's a negative conception of freedom. And although for whatever reason, and Harrison's better on this than I can, if you want to diagnose the problem, right, in terms of our current like capitalist epoch, okay, we can do that. But for whatever reasons, people do these days often celebrate the notion of an unguided, absolutely free, voluntaristic will. The problem with that conception of the will is that it is fatal poison to solidarity. You cannot build agreement and solidarity with other people, let alone across cultures, languages, and geographical divides, on the basis of something negative. It's again, logical fallacy. It's trying to derive a positive conclusion, political solidarity, from a negative premise, unguided will. That's why we're opposed to voluntarism. And I would only add this, that it is the other side of the coin of an antinomian or lawless universe, right? Only if the universe is lawless, or at least locally lawless, not guided by something like a principle of sufficient reason or natural laws, can there be room for a spontaneous will. And the converse is also true. If the universe is completely lawless, antinomian, a booming buzz and confusion, it calls out for the need for a strong will to compose it, for there to be anything to talk about. These two things are not separable. If you don't like antinomianism, the bad news for you is that you have to also not like voluntarism. These are two sides of the conceptual coin, I would say.
Fascinating, because again, it's kind of like calling somebody a hipster, which is nobody's ever going to say, yes, I am a hipster. You're right. Well,
Right.
well, it just so happens that many of the philosophers you call voluntarists are probably going to say, why are you calling me a voluntarist? I do not profess such commitments. So Harrison, can you say a little bit more, and maybe can you reference how some of the thinkers, especially I'm thinking here on the left accelerationist side, fall into this voluntarist position?
So someone like Brassier is going to say he's not a voluntarist, especially in the essay he wrote for the Accelerate reader, Prometheanism and its critics. The reason he's not is he thinks that's too tied to the human subject, the human frame, in a way. So in trying to exceed that conception of voluntarism as tied to the human frame, you need a conception of reason, which he says is going to totally destitute the subject, meaning you need to get over all these parochial myths about the human, about what Sellers calls the manifest image, and we need to embrace science full throttle. And this is going to, for Brassier, have this emancipatory edge. It's just that what does Brassier or Negrestani or Wolfendale really mean by reason? And reason tends to morph into what classical rationalists like Descartes and Spinoza called the imagination. So it's very free-floating. It can revise its norms. It's free in its commitments. And what seems like good old-fashioned Enlightenment reason is really much more existentialist and romantic. In fact, you have this conception of reason that is not mirroring the laws of nature, that is actually distinct from it and is able to legislate freely its own laws, its own norms, its own commitments onto the world. But then what is the standard for that? And they say, well, the standard is reason. But then what determines that? So it becomes very circular, very quick. And that's why this conception of reason leads to a logic of hyperstition. And this is a really core concept for accelerationists working out of the CCRU project. Hyperstition is basically taking these myths, these fantasies, these notions, and willing them into existence. There's this...
Or memeing too.
Or memeing things into existence. What some people on the alt-right would call chaos magic. We're going to meme Donald Trump into existence. In fact, with the election of Donald Trump, some people in left accelerationism were kind of jealous about...
Yeah, they saw it almost as a proof of the hyperstition thesis.
That's right. So there's this tract called #TheAltWoke Manifesto. And in learning from people like Jordan Peterson or Donald Trump supporters, we need to engage in mimetic warfare. We need to engage in this kind of meme warfare, if you will. So if the alt-right is talking about certain people in the Democratic Party being in Pizzagate or the Bilderberg group, well, we're going to say that about Peter Thiel. And there's a kind of envy, there's a kind of jealousy that people on the left have for people on the right when they succeed. But that's very dangerous kind of thinking, because we on the left cannot succeed with that kind of mysticism. In fact, this goes back to an older debate that Lukács had with Ernst Bloch. And one of Lukács's students named Gunthers, he was adamant against Bloch trying to synthesize what Lukács called right-wing epistemology with left-wing ethics, because the kinds of myth-making and irrationalism and unreason is how the right will succeed. If the left wants to engage in that kind of thinking, then it renders our own commitments to reason and intelligibility and human emancipation inoperable. It's like mixing oil and water in that sense.
So their conception of reason is ultimately submitted to a kind of infinite regress. There's not a kind of stable basis by which a principle of sufficient reason can be deduced or adhered to. Is that kind of what you're saying here?
Coming out of the speculative realist tradition with Clinton Miloso, there is this rejection of the principle of sufficient reason as being a human imposition onto reality. You don't want to tell reality what to do. I mean, having a principle of sufficient reason is too deterministic.
Mm-hmm.
It's human, all too human, to have the principle of sufficient reason, and that goes back to Nietzsche's criticisms of causality itself as being too humanist and even too democratic. Because if you do have the principle of sufficient reason, then things operate according to cause and effect. Things are intelligible, and if things are intelligible, you can know them, and if you can know them, you can change them.
So that actually leads me to invite you to say something about how the Gaians also have thrown out a logic of cause and effect. And can you describe a little bit of their very strange vision, which is not a Spinozist understanding of the relationship between cause and effect? And I want to actually look at what Spinoza says there, because you end your book with a look at Spinoza. But can you say something about the Gaians and how they look at how effects kind of precede causes in a certain? We can't get at can't really speak of causes in a certain sense for them.
So the main bone of contention between the accelerationists and the eco-pessimists has to do with the status of phenomenology and experience. So the accelerationists, in wanting to embrace the scientific image, in order to embrace the sciences, the hard sciences, they're going to say our experiences are not necessarily commensurate with this alien reality. So we need to follow what the sciences are saying. If the science reveals this kind of alien reality, we should go with that. And if we have certain felt experiences about free will or just human agency, well, we need to get beyond that. That might not be true. The Gaians, especially you have Viveros and Latour, they're arguing for a phenomenologically oriented politics. That really, the problem with these sciences is that they're impersonal, they're alienating, and they're going to seek to dominate or live life world. So with Latour, this idea of causality is rationalist mysticism, because cause and effect, the future coming from the past, is not how we experience things, how we see things. We start with the effects, we live with the effects, and then we search for the causes later. And Latour says in the Gifford Lectures, Facing Gaia, that if you have effects just come from causes, that's not how we live our lives. We live our lives in terms of a dramatic narrative, that we experience things first, and then we search for the causes. If you start the other way around, you're going to deanimate reality. You're going to have a dead experience. So in order to have a lived experience, in order to remain true to our own life world, we have to flip the logic of causality. The effects actually precede the causes now. And if you don't think that way, then you're just way too abstract, and you're engaged in your own kind of rationalist making, your own kind of rationalist religion.
Yeah.
What's extremely bizarre.
Very strange. Yeah, please.
Oh, sorry. Well, what's extremely bizarre about this is that from the side of the eco-pessimists, the Gaians, the motivation here is to supposedly naturalize everything and not cut everything to the human form, right? Not make humans central. That's their hostility to Enlightenment reason, regardless of their signifiers that they use. But once you insist that nature has to conform to dramatic narrative, and therefore the effects are prior to the causes, because that's what's interesting to humans who observe things phenomenologically, that's a kind of hyper-humanism. It's a hyper anthropocentrism, because everything has to be interesting to us. Whereas Spinoza, an actual naturalist, will say that it doesn't matter what's interesting or good for us humans. Nature operates according to its own universal laws. And if it's not interesting or dramatic or narratively pleasing to you, tough, right? I mean, that's the genuinely naturalist position. So it's very ironic that they sort of invert themselves this way. They also invert themselves and invert Spinoza by, Spinoza's naturalism gets rid of teleology in the sort of bad providential sense, that things exist a certain way because there's a plan, a providential plan in the future. That kind of teleology. But if effects are prior to the causes, they're bringing teleology back. They're also bringing the free will back. And they believe, people like Chakrabarty, especially Latour, that they can naturalize the idea of the will, not by tying it to, cause and effect or the intellect or natural laws, but by exploding it, by multiplying the wills. So everything has a will. The rock has a will. Rivers have a will. If you have enough wills, it somehow they think magically, it's a natural picture again.
Yeah, you made a nice example of this by showing how some Gaian conferences on the future of ecology will have such a strange perspectivism that things like the perspective of the ocean is meant to have its own panel, right? Its own representative body, or the trees, or things like this. So there's a kind of they do sneak back in a weird anthropocentrism through the back door. Very, very, very odd. Yeah, very odd. I'm wondering now how Spinoza fits in here, because there's two more things I want to talk about. I want to talk about Spinoza, and I want to talk about myth making. Can we start with Spinoza? I think, it seems like Spinoza is getting a lot of things more coherent for this whole, like, Spinoza kind of comes in and parts these two camps and sort of brings a lot more light and clarity. Why does Spinoza do that, and why does he, I guess, remain the prince of the philosophers still now in our own time? It's quite incredible. And what is your sort of, for the benefit of listeners, I mean, maybe even we could say sort of why is Spinoza so important for us right now? Like, why is, we can talk about Marx, we can talk about Marxist humanism, but I feel like Spinoza is the figure for you that is maybe even more central or more kind of more corrective of a philosopher. Kind of is that fair to say, or am I giving Spinoza too much credit?
I think it's not possible to give Spinoza too much credit.
I knew you were going to say that. I set you up for that, Landon.
Thank you. 2 reasons. I think there's 2 reasons. Number one, Spinoza masterfully threads this needle of naturalism and humanism. Okay, and by the way, it's not just Spinoza, right? So Marx will talk about communism being the solution to the riddle of naturalism and humanism. Okay, so there's a lineage there. You get this in different form before Spinoza too. You get it with the Stoics, especially Seneca. Okay, but Spinoza is very systematic about it. Naturalism and humanism, right? Nature, substance comes before the human frames. It's not phenomenological. Okay, but because we're part of an intelligible nature, there is a human essence which can be known, and because nature is inherently causa sui, self-causing. Okay, every part of nature, including human beings, therefore have what he calls a conatus, a striving to maintain themselves and thrive. Humans, because we're self-conscious, self-consciously so. Okay, we're egoistic. Solidarity, egoism, hedonism, all of this comes from Spinoza's metaphysics, which again is both humanistic and naturalistic. That's one. Number 2 is that Spinoza had the distinct benefit of living and dying before Immanuel Kant took his first breath. Okay, and I wanted to interrupt earlier, but I do that too much. Okay, you asked like what's the main ideological conjunction of the eco-pessimists on the one hand and the Prometheans on the other, and Spinoza, my gosh, Harrison was quite right to point out that they both sort of take their cue in different ways from contemporary bourgeois society, late capitalism. This is true, but philosophically, they are Kantian or post-Kantian. Okay, and what I mean by this, okay, is that Kant has this distinction between the appearances, what we can know and talk about, and on the other hand, the thing in itself. And that's not what Spinoza does. That's the other thing, and it's of course related to the first. Spinoza, being a proper high Enlightenment rationalist, believes that we absolutely can know reality. We can know the thing in itself, and that's why we're not stuck in a position of self-imposed humiliation or humility or mysticism or just sort of praxis. Okay, we can actually know how things are. We can know what the good is for particular aspects of nature, and we can attempt, although imperfectly, to achieve those things. Those 2 reasons, that's why Spinoza is the sort of preeminent philosopher, I think, to solve these issues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. So, wow. Okay. Yeah, I guess, well, we once again, we're throwing Kant under the bus in popular culture right now, at least on Twitter. Kant is being accused by James Lindsay and the far right in America as the founder of CRT, critical race theory, which is a totally cockamamie suggestion.
Yeah.
Harrison, what do you have to add here about Spinoza and his place for you in this wider, in contemporary philosophy? What would you say?
Well, just to say something about Kant for a minute. Lenin made an important distinction in Materialism and Imperial Criticism in 1908, saying there's a left-wing way to attack Kant and there's a right-wing way to attack Kant. And what we're seeing at these Supreme Court confirmation hearings is the right-wing critique of Kant. Having said that, when it comes to contemporary Spinozism, certainly after May 68 philosophy, you see what Landon and I call in our essay substance abuse against Deleuze. So we wrote this essay called Substance Abuse, called Spinoza contra Deleuze. And you see a kind of jettisoning of Spinoza's rationalistic metaphysics in favor of a kind of formalistic approach to Spinoza. You definitely see this with Althusser, who doesn't really have any need for monistic substance metaphysics. He prefers a kind of pluralistic metaphysics that you see in aleatory materialism. Deleuze famously said that we can't really start with substance. What we really should start with are the attributes and the modes. And he famously said in Difference in Repetition that the substance is going to revolve around the modes and not vice versa. So you have a very pluralizing, postmodern, Nietzscheanizing view of Spinoza from the get-go. And even in today's accelerationist versus eco-pessimist debates, sometimes they do invoke Spinoza. So with, let's say, Mark Fisher, there's this idea of Spinoza as this radical Enlightenment thinker that allows us to see the outside beyond the human. And this is informed by this image of Spinoza as anti-humanist. So it's funny how the image of Spinoza as anti-humanist enables this kind of antinomian Spinozism of reality, kind of unhinged from just regular old cause and effect determinism. And you see the banner of Spinoza as this neo-materialist, neo-vitalist in some of the Gaian discourse with Isabella Stingers, and she's defending herself as a Spinozist. So you do have this evacuation of the rationalist content of Spinoza that was performed by people like Althusser and Deleuze in favor of structuralist and post-structuralist reading of Spinoza. And Landon and I are much more, in a way, neo-Hegelian in the way we appreciate Spinoza, out of the tradition of someone like Heine or Moses Hess or Ludwig Feuerbach or Marx and Engels themselves. Mm-hmm. We see Spinoza as a champion of reason and human emancipation, that mm-hmm. together we can conquer fortune together, as he said in the Ethics. And it's not for nothing that Spinoza wrote not just the first two books of the Ethics on metaphysics and on the physical world and on how thinking works as an attribute, but he also wrote books 3, 4, and 5 on human emotions, human passions, and human emancipation, that human beings are unique because we are one of the ways God understands itself, that the universe understands itself through human beings. And that is something that is unique, at least as far as we know about human beings. We are one of the ways the universe knows itself, or nature knows itself.
What's the best way to read Spinoza for someone who has not jumped in? How do you start, and how do you read Spinoza well?
My best advice, because I'm teaching Spinoza all the time, is don't read any of the secondary material, mm-hmm. including ours. Everyone has an agenda. At least not first. Mm-hmm. Read the first 14 propositions 100 mm-hmm. times. Mm-hmm. That's it, because it's mm-hmm. That's the beauty of Spinoza and the geometric method, which is to say that the first 14 propositions prove why we have to have a certainly true idea of a substance which is simple, which is self-causing, therefore infinite, and therefore an intelligible infinite universe. If you can figure out why, if indeed that's true, why that's true, to my mind, absolutely everything else falls into place. Why the mind is the way it is, why the emotions are the way it is, the nature of human bondage, the nature of human emancipation, solidarity, even aspects of his political work, the TTP, why the state has to have the sorts of rights and laws and remedies that it does. All of this emanates from the notion that we are just one modification of an infinitely intelligible universe. Mm-hmm. So the first 14 propositions, page and a half or whatever, mm-hmm. get that first.
Great. Very helpful. I'd like to end our conversation with an understanding of why the left should not be afraid of myths, and what that might look like, what future use of myths, how to appropriate and relate to myths on the left better than we currently do, with less fear of mysticism coming in. Although, with that said, there's many left people that maybe aren't afraid of using myths mystically, and why might that be a problem? So can we talk a little bit, and this really comes out a bit in your conclusion, and I'm sorry, in your epilogue, right? What what that might look like. I for one see the contemporary left as pretty myth deprived. Maybe that's a bad thing. I feel like this connects to the question of art and aesthetics as well. You know, I feel like a thinker like Bertolt Brecht is an interesting interlocutor here. Maybe you could introduce some thinkers that might help us process and relate to myths differently. So talk about that a little bit, because I do think, and I'll stop here, we studied the alt-right during the Trump period as a myth-making machine. And of course, we already talked about the hyperstition thing and meaning into power and stuff like that. So there's a certain way you can kind of need to avoid that mimetic rivalry. But how do you do myth-making outside of the mimetic hyperstition model, if that makes sense?
So I would say the better the myth, the stronger the idea. And really what connects people like Plato, Freud, Brecht, and Shelley together as strong myth makers of a critical rationalism is they had very strong Weltanschauungs. They had very coherent ideas philosophically. So I think that what we really need to focus on is not just myth making, but really getting our ideas right and getting them coherent. Because some of the most powerful works of art are undergirded by a very powerful worldview. But even more than just having a powerful worldview, I don't want to talk about it in terms of it being powerful or epic. I think it needs to be true. And that's what Marxism provides. Marxism provides something that is powerful because it's true. It's related to reality. And why the symbols of, let's say, the Russian Revolution, the Red Star, the hammer and sickle, were so momentous is because they were tied into a real movement. And I think we got to tap into that reality. If we don't tap into that reality with the right kind of theory, our myths are going to be pretty threadbare. It's going to sound like the old woke manifesto that we want to imitate, the success of the alt-right or Trump supporters. I think getting your ideas right and having that positive foundation with Spinoza, with Hegel, with Marx and Engels, with Trotsky and Luxemburg, that's going to generate better ideas. Mm-hmm. And those better ideas can serve as inspiration for its poetics or its myth or its novelization even. When Lukács talks about Dante's Divine Comedy and the theory of the novel, he said he had an idea of the totality. That's what makes the Divine Comedy such an amazing work, even though we might not agree with the Catholic metaphysics, of course. But it is some kind of worldview that's animating the work, either in Homer or Dante or Shakespeare. You have some kind of Weltanschauung that's animating the art. So I think that needs to come first, as thinkers in general.
I think it also comes down to just the kinds of creatures we necessarily are. We are finite embodied creatures who have an intellect, but also bodies. And so we do not only exist in prose, we also have an imagination. Spinoza did not deny that we had the imagination, that we had emotions. Okay. What he was against were the sad passions, right? Being passive in relation to our body and the images and the emotions. It's no good trying to pretend these things don't exist, because the repressed will just return with a vengeance, okay? Or will be ceded to the worst elements, the most alt-right fringe elements of society. What we have to do is to cultivate our images and cultivate our poetry, and that means instrumentalizing them, okay, to express reason. And I'll tell you this, when I express this to many of my students who take, contemporary world religions with me, especially the religious ones, this idea that, these images are mythic and they are meant to be instrumentalized to express something outside of themselves, that's shocking to them. Okay, but that's important, okay, because when we confidently and openly say we're going to use myth, we're going to make myth, and we're going to use them as a tool to express ideas which are true, independent of those images, we don't have to worry anymore. Okay, we don't have to worry that they're going to have an independent mystical power over us. We're using them as a tool. If we neglect them, then the tool will be used against us.
Yeah. Gosh, wow. I guess one of the questions for you is sort of, and this is maybe for another conversation, is how do you do this with the awareness that Lukács said against Ernst Bloch, which is not to do myth making with a commitment to right-wing epistemology. So you said Schelling can be an ally to a rationalist form of myth. Well, yes, but which Schelling? So that there's that question. I wonder, Harrison, what you might say to that, just as one response. Like, how do you address the right-wing epistemology problem there?
Well, if you're going to address it epistemologically, it has to be a philosophical metaphysical argument. In terms of myth, as Percy Shelley said in his preface to Prometheus Unbound, he's coming at the Aeschylus myth instrumentally. He has a political agenda in mind, he has a philosophical agenda in mind, and he thinks that the way Aeschylus ended the myth was unrealistic, that Prometheus and Zeus would just shake hands and that would be it. He says, no, we need to go further with the Promethean idea of freedom. And the only way we're going to get free is if we're self-consciously free. And that means the masses in the image of the demigorgon have to become free. So for Shelley, the art is important. As Landon said, we're bodily creatures. We think with our senses and our imagination. That needs to be cultivated, as Plato said. And Shelley was a big fan of Plato. So the way that Shelley was talking about Prometheus Unbound was very important, as opposed to his partner, his wife, Mary Shelley, talking about Frankenstein as modern Prometheus. The way that Mary Shelley depicts Frankenstein as a modern Prometheus is very pessimistic, very conservative. And there seems to be a difference between the way Mary Shelley's talking about the Promethean archetype versus the way Percy is. So when Mary's talking about Prometheus, Victor Frankenstein, it's almost proto-Nietzschean. He's this mad scientist, and he wants to just create for its own sake. He's very egotistical, and he really doesn't care about mass need. When the way Percy Shelley talks about Prometheus, he is fully humanitarian. There might have been those humanitarian aspects in Aeschylus, but he's transitioned into, well, really in the vanguard of a kind of socialist imagination that we're talking about here. In fact, Marx told Eleanor that if Shelley didn't die when he did in that boating accident, he would be in the vanguard of socialism. And if Byron didn't die in the Greek Civil War, he would have been a right-wing reactionary Tory.
Wow. Okay, yes, no, Percy Shelley. And I was also invoking Schelling. It was a whole other I don't want to get into Schelling because
we could get into Schelling.
We could get into Schelling, but I also want to respect your time. But let's say something briefly about Schelling. Out of curiosity, let's do it. In previous interviews, and Schelling's come up a lot in Destruction of Reason. Schelling is identified by Lukács as a kind of really one of the origins of irrationalism within German idealism. But Schelling is also, especially throughout his whole career, is a thinker of the mythological. So how can the left use Schelling's ideas of myth? What do you make of it?
I think Schelling, in our distinction between the mythic and the mystical, is much more mystical than mythic in our sense. I think the way he talks about the Titanic, especially, is proto-Nietzschean. That you have these Titanic super artists who are able to see further than the mere masses because they have this esoteric knowledge of nature and they're able to create, and how destabilizing that can possibly be. That's a very antinomian mystical idea. And when Schelling's giving his lectures at the University of Berlin on mythology and the positive philosophy of Christianity, I agree with the young Engels that this is just medieval superstition, and that Schelling has come a very long way past his Spinozistic origins in his break with Fichte. Not that Schelling's break with Fichte and his partnership with Hegel was completely rationalist. I think there are always elements of irrationalism in Schelling, but there were good aspects of Schelling in terms of using Spinoza to attack Fichtean subjective idealism. These are the aspects that Hegel appreciated and that Hegel radicalized even further. And then eventually they drifted apart. It's an old story. But really in 1808, when Schelling is writing the Treatise on Freedom, he rejects German idealism. He rejects Spinoza. And someone like Martin Heidegger says that when Schelling wrote the Treatise on Freedom in 1808, he annihilates Hegel's project of the science of logic in 1812, 4 years before it was even written. So I do see Schelling as, I would give Schelling critical support in the break with Fichte in 1800. I encourage people to look at Hegel's pro-Schelling writings in those early years, which don't come without criticism of Schelling. So there's a rational aspect of Schelling, which I think is Spinozistic, and then there's this neo-Kantian romantic aspect of Schelling that gets worse and worse and worse as he develops further. So when he's talking about mythology in the philosophy of art, I mean, a lot of it is mystical, and I would reject it as properly mythic in the sense that Landon and I talk about.
Great. Well, my friends, this has been really fascinating. I really love your perspectives on the current ecological crisis that we're facing, and you've given us such a great framework to think through it together. And I just want to thank you for coming on the show. I hope there's nothing that I missed. If there is something that I did, please feel free to speak up. Otherwise, I'll conclude now and just make a plug that Landon's going to be giving his third talk on Engels's anti-Düring in our group. Not this Sunday, but the one after. And I'll actually link to that in the show notes as well. But it's going to be a great final third presentation on socialism and what Engels says about socialism in that incredible text, Anti-Düring. So definitely check it out on the YouTube, or you can even join us as well. It's a free public seminar. So we'll close here, and just want to thank you for a great conversation. And thanks again for writing this book. This is through Anthem Press. What's the best way that folks can get this book? How can they purchase it? What's the best way to get a hold of it?
So it's available on, I believe, the Amazon, Barnes & Noble website as well. Both Amazon and Barnes & Noble and the Anthem website.
Available in ebook, print. It's in hardback right now. Is that right?
It's in hardback right now.
And we're going to lobby very soon for a soft cover to come out. And I think with the soft cover edition, we really want to expand on our discussion of the Olympians. They're the kind of third party that we talk about in the last sections, but we really think they deserve their own section. So we're going to have a special chapter devoted to Jordan Peterson as epitomizing the Olympian position. And the title of that is going to be called Olympus Has Fallen.
Okay. We'll have you back to discuss Peterson, because I know Harrison, actually you both have written quite a lot about Jordan Peterson, and that's a nut that we need to crack on a different occasion. Again, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Landon and Harrison, for a very enlightening conversation. We'll see you next time, guys.